What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be discussing the Sorc tank. So Sorc tanks are not quite as popular as they have been in the past. Sorc tanks, specifically, their main weakness is the overall lack of group utility that DK tanks, Warden tanks bring to the table. What Sorc tanks really excel at, on the other hand, is just raw mitigation. They have a pretty decent shielding ability, which Nightblade tanks lack. Plus, they have some additional block mitigation through the use of bound armaments or bound ages, depending on which morph you use. That being said, though, Nightblade tanks did get a little bit of a buff over the past two patches. A little bit of a nerf this patch, but generally speaking, they have gotten a buff to overall survivability. Combine that with the fact that this is a stamina-heavy meta, and so the Minor Prophecy from a Sorc tank is not particularly useful anymore. And you kind of see where Sorc tanks are kind of falling in popularity. That being said, Sorc tanks are still capable of clearing all pieces of content, so don't let that discourage you from running a Sorc tank if that is what you want to do. So just like the rest of our build videos, we're going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build yourself. We'll be talking in depth about the different skills and different sets that you're going to have on hand as a support role, depending on the specific strategies, the specific fight types, so on and so forth. So we will be discussing in length about all that. And then because we are a support role, we don't really do a DPS parse, as you can imagine, and so instead we'll be talking about what makes a Sorc tank different from your traditional Dragon Knight tank, as well as your general philosophy behind tanking. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. Starting off with monster helm sets. I like Symphony of Blades. Symphony of Blades is a very powerful resource sustain set. It does require you to have some sort of group heal, so something like Vigor, Energy Orbs, or in the case of a Sorc specific ability, Search. Basically grants people additional magic or stamina, whichever resource is higher, every second for 6 seconds, once every 18 seconds. So very powerful sustain. This is one of the strongest sustain sets in the game right now that you can use as a tank, so very powerful here. There are a couple of other options for Monster Helm Sets, though, that I'll quickly go over for everybody. Just working our way from the top and starting our way down. So the first one is going to be Earthcore, which is a nice burst heal for a single person, and it'll always proc whenever you need it, so don't feel like it'll proc on somebody that's at full health or anything. The downside of running Earthcore is that it is a single person and it procs every 35 seconds, so not particularly useful in all situations. In certain situations, it is useful, so a good example of this would be something like Cloud Rest if you're the portal tank to help combat any sort of damage you're taking under the portal, Baneful Mark, Cloud Rest, or not Cloud Rest, I already talked about Cloud Rest, Sunspire Hard Mode, the Cassie specifically to help out with the ice prisons if your healers are having a little bit of difficulty, but it's a very niche use set now, mainly due to the fact that it only hits one person every 35 seconds. From there you have Lord Warden, which is a very traditional tanking set, a little bit of survivability for you and a survivability for everybody within 8 meters of you, so really great, especially in this stamina heavy meta where you have people pretty much ganged up on the boss's butt. Gives them a little bit more survivability, which, if it ends up saving them from any sort of like a big AoE hit, is definitely worth it, because a dead DPS deals no DPS, so you would be increasing DPS that way. Next is Bloodspawn, which is probably the only base game Monster Helm set, complete Monster Helm set, that a tank could run. Whenever you take damage, you have a chance to generate ultimate and gain physical and spell resistance, so you're not really going to be using this for this physical and spell resistance, mainly because there's such a low uptime on it. You're mainly here for the additional ultimate generation. The ultimate generation does allow you to get faster Warhorns, which in turn improves major force uptime, which, as you can expect, increases overall DPS. Next we have Thurvokun, which comes from Fengler. This, whenever you take damage, creates a growing pool of bile, which deals certain amount of disease damage every second, and also afflicts enemies with Minor Maim and Minor Defile. Minor Defile, not that big of a deal in PvE. Minor Maim, on the other hand, is a pretty big deal, mainly because Sorc tanks don't really have a native source of AoE Minor Maim in any of their class abilities, and so you will instead need to use Thurvokun, which is a pretty decent set to use in sort of AoE trash fights. Next you have Vykosa, which applies Major Maim when you bash an enemy you've taunted for 3 seconds. This is a very powerful set for progression style guilds, and you can anticipate the damage coming in. It's a very good debuff. The only other source of Major Maim comes from ultimates, and so being able to do this pretty much whenever you want every 15 seconds is very, very powerful for overall survivability. I've used this in Sunspire hard mode, and I've seen it being used to great effect in Asylum hard mode progressions to help combat the fireballs from St. Olm and Execute, as well as from the Wiltis and Felms. The next two sets are going to be a little bit more selfish, Stonekeeper and Grundwolf. Stonekeeper, every 20 seconds, you can basically restore 5350 stamina, magicka, and health before any sort of modifiers to the health part at least, as long as you block an attack. Once you block 6 attacks, you'll be able to release the energy, and then you can't gain new charges until 14 seconds. So it basically gives you a 20-second cooldown, assuming you get a stack per second. Grundwolf is a little bit weaker than Stonekeeper, so whenever you deal critical damage, you get 1000 magic or stamina, whichever is higher, and then 500 of the other resource. The cooldown on this is a lot lower. It's 5 seconds, but if you do the math, it ends up being 4000 magic or stamina and 2000 of the other resource, making it weaker than Stonekeeper. So I personally would recommend running Stonekeeper instead of Grundwolf if you were just looking for a raw sustain-oriented set here. Next, going over our gear sets. So again, this is just one of many potential combinations. You have multiple sets that you're going to want to have on hand in order to fit the overall situation. For our first set here, we have Perfected Yolnahkriin, which comes from Sunspire, Veteran Sunspire. Doesn't have to be hard mode or anything like that. This set is the only source of minor courage in the game right now. So minor courage usually ends up being, depending on your DPS's initial weapon and spell damage, about 2 to 2.5, upwards of 3% additional damage done. So pretty decent set to have on hand. A little bit weaker compared to something like Powerful Assault, but because it is a heavy armor set and it is a unique source of minor courage, you definitely want to have this on at least one of your tanks in any sort of raid group. In addition, because it is a heavy armor set, you can wear this on the body, which frees up your jewelry and weapons for a medium armor or light armor set instead. A good classic example of a medium armor set would be Roar of Alkosh, which comes from the Maw of Rakaj trial. So this is still the most powerful debuff set that a tank can wear, most powerful support set that a tank can use to help support their DPS. Whenever you activate Ascendancy, you send out a shockwave which deals physical damage and also reduces the physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by 3010 for 10 seconds. So overall, a very powerful set here. The resistance debuff is a minimum of an additional about 6% increase in damage done. So very powerful debuff set here, but it is a medium armor set, so you will need to get the jewelry and the weapons. So for gold jewelry, you will need to do Veteran Maw of Rakaj in order to get gold jewelry, or if you want, you can try to upgrade your normal jewelry, your normal blue jewelry, up to gold. In terms of traits and enchants, before we go over other sets here, there are kind of a couple schools of thoughts when it comes to your overall traits for armor. I personally like Infused on my large pieces and Sturdy on my small pieces. But some people like to just go straight up all sturdy. It's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. If you feel like your sustain is fine, and you can go with Infused on your large pieces. But a lot of people prefer sturdy on all their pieces around the board in order to help out their overall stamina sustain. For enchants, at the very least you want prismatic on your large pieces. I personally like to reserve my small pieces to kind of fine-tune my build by swapping out my enchants. But you could just go for a generic sort of build here and just go with all prismatics if you'd prefer. In terms of jewelry traits, you have a few options when it comes to jewelry traits. I am a personal fan favorite of at least keeping one of them to be Harmony for the additional resource return that you get from shards and orbs. But some people don't personally like Harmony because it doesn't seem like a very strong trait. Other potential traits are Triune, like I have here, which is basically another prismatic enchant, or Infused. Triune and Infused are both kind of very good generic one-size-fits-all sort of trait. You could also go with Arcane, Healthy, or Robust, depending on what sort of max resource you'd like most on your build. For enchants, the main two enchants that I've seen are going to be Shieldplate enchants to reduce the cost of block, and magicka regen enchants in order to help your overall magicka regen. Kind of up to you which ones you want to go for. It really depends on what sustain you need. More stamina sustain, or more magicka sustain. I've also seen potion cooldown glyphs in order to help out your sustain by just allowing you to drink potions more frequently. This does end up costing you more in gold in the long run because potions are obviously fairly expensive. And then for our shield, Sturdy with prismatics, and then our one-handed weapon, there's basically 3 primary traits that you can go for. All of them are pretty poor options, but you're kind of making the best out of a bad situation here. I like to have Decisive for the additional chance of getting ultimate, although it really isn't all that much. The other two options are going to be Infused for stronger enchants, and then Charged if you're running a shock damage enchant on the back bar to help with concussed uptime and therefore off balance uptime. Your enchant on your front bar depends. You can go with whatever you'd like. Absorb stam, absorb health, absorb magicka, weapon, or weakening. Anything like that would work just fine on your front bar. You can also go with something like drain stamina poisons if you'd like. Major breach poison, minor breach poison, minor fracture poisons, up to you. For your back bar, you have a couple of options when it comes to just weapon choice. So you have ice staves, lightning staves, bows, and if you want, you can just go double sword and board again. Generally speaking, you will want to go with ice staff, lightning staff, or bow though, just so that way you get the max enchant bonus here. So Infused with a Crusher enchant is typically speaking your base kind of go-to. You can also replace the enchant with a shock damage enchant to help with concussed uptime and therefore off-balance uptime. The ice staff you're going to be using if you want a little bit more mitigation from your Destro staff passives. You also have the option of using magicka to block with ice staves. A lot of tanks don't like this. Kind of depends on how, if you're able to micromanage both resources fairly decently well. Lightning staves helps with off-balance uptime with lightning blockade, and bow just helps out with off DPSing, plus endless hail is a pretty good move for overall DPS as well as enchant procking. So those are your kind of three options for when it comes to weapons. Now as to other sets here, starting off with dungeon sets. Under the heavy dungeon sets, I guess we'll start from the bottom and work our way up. We have Dragon's Defilement, which is one of the new sets from Lair of Marsalok. This basically applies minor fracture and minor breach whenever you take damage from a melee attack to enemies around you. This is very useful for trash pulls because even if you have a Templar in the group, kind of hard and a little bit too much to ask for them to just get power of light on everything. Dragon's Defilement just kind of gives you your Templar a little bit of chance to back off and focus on other things like buffing allies instead. Next, we have Jailor's Tenacity, which is a more selfish-oriented set. So when you lose 7,000 or more health from a single attack, you gain major vitality for 5 seconds. So this is kind of niche use. It's very similar to Earthcore, where you kind of have to know the fight and know how much damage you're taking. Good examples of where I've seen Jailor's Tenacity used fairly effectively would be places like Sunsparrow Hard Mode for progression style stuff, and Cloud Rest in order to help combat Baneful Mark in order to get yourself back up faster in Execute. But not a very commonly used set. It's mostly used in sort of progression or very, very niche scenarios. Next is Leeching Plate, which is great for AoE pulls, where you just need to stay alive. A good example of this would be something like Black Rose Prison with all the ad pulls and things like that. So whenever you take damage, you basically have a chance to summon a Cloud of Poison, which deals poison damage and heals you for the same amount that you managed to deal. So the more poison damage you deal, the more you heal. So if you have like 6 mobs that are getting dealt this poison damage, you're getting a lot of healing done. So that's where Leeching Plate really stands out. Finally, we have Ebon Armory, which is a classic tanking set. Base game set, comes from Crypt of Hearts here. It increases max health by 1,000 for you and up to 11 group members within 28 meters of you. So keep in mind this is before things like CPs and minor toughness, so it will end up being higher, usually about 1.3 to 1.4k instead, after you kind of include any sort of modifiers. A very good set. It allows your DPS to focus more on just raw DPS, rather than focusing on getting some more health for survivability. So really powerful set here to run as tanks, even though it was nerfed a little bit in Scalebreaker. Next, for Overland Sets, there are a handful of Overland Sets here. Starting with heavy armor sets, we have Plague Doctor, which is the quintessential selfish tank set. Just adds raw max health. Really great if you're just starting to learn how to tank, but once you kind of know how to get the hang of the fight, get the hang of tanking, you're definitely going to want to shift away from Plague Doctor. But it's still really good for progression, and if you're just starting to learn mechanics and things like that. Next, we have Akaviri Dragonguard, which reduces the cost of your ultimate by 15%. This does stack with the Sorc already 15% cost reduction, so it moves your Warhorn costs down even further, giving you even higher major force uptime for even more DPS. But beyond that, the only other set here is going to be Livewire, which basically applies concussion to enemies within 8 meters of you whenever you take damage. So pretty nice to help out with overall off-balance uptime in trash fights, but that's really the only reason why you would use Livewire here. Finally, for trial sets, we've already talked actually about the only trial set that I would potentially pick up, which is Yolnahkriin. All the other heavy trial sets are not that great for tanks, so don't even bother trying to pick up any sort of other heavy armor sets for tanking. Now, there are a couple of light medium sets that you want to have on hand here. First, under the light armor line here, you want to have Worm's Raiment on hand, which reduces the cost of magic abilities by 4%. Pretty nice to have for Vaults of Madness, so base game set, light armor set, so jewelry and weapons. And then under the medium armor set line, under the dungeon set here, you also have Ursine's Veneer, which is basically the stamina version of Worm. So instead of reducing magic abilities, it reduces the cost of stamina abilities by 4% instead. Again, medium armor set, so make sure to get the jewelry and the weapons. There is one light armor overland set that you might want to consider picking up here, and that's going to be Marshal Knowledge. So while your stamina is below 50%, your light attacks cause the enemy to take 8% additional damage for 5 seconds. This effect can occur once every 8 seconds. This effectively gives it a 5% additional damage taken debuff on the enemy if you can proc it off cooldown. Now, the challenge with Martial Knowledge is the fact that it only procs while your stamina is under 50%, so you have to basically maintain below 50% max stamina, which is a little bit daunting for a lot of beginner tanks, and even endgame tanks find it a little bit challenging to kind of maintain that, because your natural reaction is, oh, my potion is up, drink my potion, and that'll instantly pop you above that 50% threshold. So a lot of people have been thinking that Martial Knowledge is better on healers instead, because they have lower stamina pools, so they're able to maintain it a little bit easier compared to on tanks, especially because stamina is basically your lifeblood as a tank. If you drop too low on stamina, you won't be able to dodge roll, won't be able to block, won't be able to break free of certain effects and things like that. But this is a potential option to wear. This comes from Craglorn, so pretty easy set to obtain. Moving on from there, pretty much all the sets. For our character sheet, I am a Nord. Nords are going to be one of the better racial options when it comes to tanking. However, races when it comes to tanking doesn't really matter all too much. I personally tank on a Dark Elf, the Dragonite. So I don't get any sort of max health bonus, I only get max magicka and max stamina. So if you take that in consideration, and I've pretty much cleared all the content in the game, race doesn't really matter too much. Of course, there are going to be better races, so Nords, Imperials, Argonians are often considered to be the best races for tanks, but it doesn't impact you quite as much, performance quite as much, I should say, compared to like on a DPS where race actually matters quite a bit. So Nords, Imperials, they both get max health and max stamina here. Nord get an additional 3960 spell and physical resistance. They also get some additional ultimate back whenever they take damage. Imperials get 3% cost reduction across the board for basically all abilities. They also get 333 magic health and stamina back whenever they deal damage. Then Argonians get, instead of max stamina, they get max magicka instead, and they get 8% additional healing done, plus 4,000 magicka health and stamina back whenever they drink any potion in the game. So your tri-stat potion just becomes that much better if you are an Argonian. For attributes, this is really going to depend on your specific race, because not all races have max health bonuses. Dark Elf, for example, doesn't have any sort of max health bonuses, so in that instance you would have more points in the health. General rule of thumb is instead go for, at the very least, 35,000 max health is kind of the bare minimum that most people recommend. Then 20k magic and stamina, as close as you can get to those two values there. That's probably going to be good enough for pretty much everything. So, for example, on a Nord, I have 20 magicka, 40 health, 4 stamina. As a Sorc, you do have access to either bound aegis or bound armaments, which increases max magicka or max stamina respectively. So use those to your advantage too while you're making your build. I'm using bound armaments here, so I can dump more points into magicka rather than stamina here. I don't have a Mundus. Your Mundus that you should be using is going to be the Atronach for additional magicka regen. So apologies, I don't have my Mundus stone here. For food, we have purple food, which gives us tri-stats, so max magicka, max health, max stamina. There is going to be a new food that's going to be released in the Witches Festival, which is basically a slightly improved version of tri-stat food. So once that goes live, definitely try to get that food there. Going over our skills now. For our front bar, this is a sword and board bar. We have Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, Unstable Clannfear, Empowered Ward. You can go with the other ward if you'd like, but I prefer Empowered Ward for the minor intellect. If you have magic DPS in group, if you don't, just stick with Hardened Ward instead. Bound Armaments, and Aggressive Warhorn. On our back bar, we have Inner Rage, Dark Deal, which we're going to be using to help us sustain. Unstable Clannfear again, you need to have this double barred. Boundless Storm, you can have Unstable Wall or Elemental Blockade. Elemental Blockade lasts for longer, so I'd personally go with that. And then Absorption Field, this ultimates can kind of be flip-flopped and it can be even swapped out. So you can, for example, put Aggressive Warhorn on the back bar and run some other ultimate on the front bar instead. Now, generally speaking, there's really not that much flex space here on a Sorc tank compared to on any other race, mainly because of your self-heal Unstable Clannfear. You could arguably just use Dark Deal as a self-heal, but Dark Deal has a cast time associated with it, so you kind of need to be very experienced with the fight, know the flow of the fight if you want to use Dark Deal. Hence why Sorc tanks are not necessarily good in a lot of content, because sometimes you won't have the time to cast Dark Deal in order to heal. For example, Sunspire, you don't have any time at all to cast Dark Deal because the dragons will attack you while you're casting it, and their unblocked light attack deals quite a bit of damage from a dragon. But once you learn to fight, you can probably find windows in which you can use Dark Deal in order to heal up as well as get that stamina back. In terms of other abilities you want to have on hand, Restraining Prison for the immobilization. You also get Major Vitality as well, but you do need to immobilize something, or I should say, as long as you hit something, you get that Major Vitality, so it might be useful for on-demand Major Vitality, but mostly not really useful in single target sort of like boss fights, more for trash pulls and things like that. If you want, instead of Unstable Clannfear, you can use Matriarch. The downside of Matriarch is that it scales off of max magicka, so you're not really going to be healing as much compared to on a Clannfear. Plus, Matriarch will heal anybody rather than just you, so it's not really good as a self-heal, it's more for kind of a group heal. Under Stormcalling, Power Surge is one potential way if you are using something like Symphony of Blades to help heal other people. Now, it does proc on activating a critical heal, so not particularly good for tanks because you, generally speaking, will not have more than just one heal. So I personally would shy away from Power Surge, but it is an option if you want to risk it for any sort of critical heal that you do. If you're using a bow, you should be using Endless Hail instead of Elemental Blockade, obviously. Under the armor lines, Unmovable is actually a pretty strong combination with Bound Armaments here because of the increase to the amount of damage you can block for every piece of heavy armor that you wear. Once you are wearing 7 pieces of heavy armor, you are able to block an additional 35% damage. The downside of this is, if you're wearing 7 pieces of heavy armor at least, you have 0 movement speed, so you'd only be able to move with roll dodging. That being said, it's still pretty nice to have that additional mitigation if you need it. So you can use this instead of Boundless Storm for the Major Ward, Major Resolve. Just keep in mind that it uses stamina, so it might not necessarily be useful all the time, versus Boundless Storm, which uses Magicka for your Major Ward, Major Resolve. Under the Fighters line, you have Ring of Preservation here. This is for the minor protection as well as the healing. It only lasts for 8 seconds, and it's mostly used in instances where you'll be stacked up to get the mana protection, so it's not going to be used for every fight, but it is useful in the fights where it can be used. Next, we have Silver Leash, which is basically going to be your pulling move. It does use stamina, so it's a little bit costly to use here, so you might want to run a monster helm set like Swarm Mothers instead for pulls, for pulling things in. But it might not necessarily be worth Swarm Mothers on, for example, boss fights where you need to chain in adds, so Silver Leash is definitely an ability you want to have. You basically need to have this as a Sorc tank. Under the Mage's Guild line, you could run Balance instead of Boundless Storm for your Major Ward, Major Resolve, plus you get some Magicka back, which does help your overall sustain. So it is one option to run, but you will reduce the healing done by 50% for 4 seconds after you use it. So just keep that in mind if you do want to use Balance here. On the Psijic Order line, you can run Introspection or Deep Thoughts for overall sustain. It gives you health, magicka, and stamina back, but you will not be able to block because it is a channeled ability. You do get major protection if you have the Deliberation passive, which decreases damage done taken by 30%, but you will be losing out on all the block mitigation if you use Deep Thoughts or Introspection. Under the Anointed line, make sure to have all these abilities unlocked. Overflowing Altar for Mana Lifesteal and Blood Feast. Shadow Soak for the damage energy, Inner Rage obviously for the ranged taunt. Bone Surge for the Spinal Surge synergy, which gives out major vitality, so really useful in places like Cloud Rest Execute to help combat Baneful Mark. Energy Orb for the heal, as well as the Healing Combustion synergy. With the changes to the orb, where you can only have one out at a time, it's actually very easy to sustain orbs now as a tank. Under the Alliance Warline, Echoing Vigor for another group heal to help proc Symphony of Blades. And then Efficient Purge if you ever need to purge anything from yourself or the group. And Reviving Barrier here as another ultimate. It also provides, if you have either of these two slotted, if you have 2 points in the Magicka Aid, you get additional 10% Magicka recovery. Moving on to our champion points, the CP cap has still not been changed, so it's still 810, which gives us 270 points across each of our different constellation types. Starting off with green CPs, I have 75 Arcanist, 49 Tenacity, 66 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 40 Warlord. The things to keep in mind here is to try to get at the very least 64 into Arcanist, 64, 75, or 100 into Arcanist. Those are the 3 jump points there. And at the very least 61 points in the Shadow Ward. So you have 61, 66, 72, and I believe 81 would be the next 4 jump points there. Definitely want to try to get those numbers, but beyond that, your green CPs can be placed wherever you feel comfortable. Next for our blue CPs, you have 100 Blessed, 81 Elfborn, 81 Precise Strikes. Those are the only nodes that matter. We have the Precise Strikes mainly because there are a few healing abilities that use stamina, so you just want to cover all your bases there. That leaves you 8 remaining points, which you can put anywhere, so I just have them in the piercing just for fun. Finally, we have our red CPs. This is going to be a very balanced approach to mitigation, so if you want to maximize mitigation against, like, let's say, magic damage, you will need to shift CP points around. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 in both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that is all of the build information. Let's talk about how Sword Tank differ from DK tanks. Starting off with the obvious, you don't have Engulfing Flames, you don't have Minor Brutality. Instead, you have Minor Prophecy, which only comes if you deal damage with something under the Dark Magic line. So this is from Exploitation. So you have to cast something from here. So in order to maintain Minor Prophecy, you would have to use Dark Deal every 20 seconds, which is good because it lines up with the duration of Dark Deal. So that's the first thing you have to keep in mind as a Sork tank. That's what differs from a DK tank. You just keep in mind Dark Deal needs to be used every 20 seconds in order to maintain Minor Prophecy. So that's the first major difference. The second major difference is that your blocking, if you're trying to take a large hit, you have an opportunity here to really reduce the damage by basically using brown armaments here. That increases the amount of damage you block by a very large amount, 36%. But beyond that, there really isn't that much difference. It's just mainly which buffs you're maintaining. So Sword Tank, you don't have to keep track of things like Engulfing Flames. You don't have to use anything like Igneous Shield or Fragmented Shield to maintain your stamina because Dark Deal lasts for 20 seconds, which is actually quite a long time. Now, the one thing to keep in mind as a Sword Tank is that Dark Deal, I mentioned this earlier, has a cast time associated with it. It has a 1.2 second cast time. So make sure to know the fight, make sure you know when you can use Dark Deal. Otherwise, you're going to be eating a big hit and you're going to end up dying. So Sword Tanks have a much steeper learning curve because of that. That's your main way of restoring stamina back, Dark Deal. Otherwise, you can also use Heavy Attacks, which, if you think about it, is basically the same thing as Dark Deal. You have about a 1.5 second kind of time before your Heavy Attack actually hits, under which time you can't block. The difference between using Dark Deal and a Heavy Attack is that you can block out of the animation for Heavy Attack, you can block out of the animation for Dark Deal, but Dark Deal is generally speaking going to be better for sustain because not only do you get stamina right away, you also get a little bit of additional stamina returning back to you over the 20-second duration. Now, in terms of tanking in general, you really have 3 jobs as a tank. First job, stay alive. Second job, taunt the things. Third job, maintain buffs and debuffs. As a Sork tank, your buffs and debuffs as a Sork is mainly going to be coming from using Dark Deal every 20 seconds. That's the only real thing you got to maintain specifically as a Sork. Otherwise, everything just comes from your armor sets, essentially. Alkosh, make sure to activate your synergy every 10 seconds. Yolnahkriin, you're taunting things, so you'll be able to maintain Yolnahkriin that way. And so on and so forth. Enchant uptime, so if you have a Crusher enchant on the backbar, make sure to have Blockade down every 12 seconds, or Endless Hail if you're using a bow backbar. That's really kind of the goal behind tanks. You're more supporting your DPS, being able to help them do as much damage as you possibly can. Obviously, first, you need to learn how to stay alive. So that involves learning the fight mechanics, learning how to play a Sorc tank, which again, like I mentioned, has a little bit of a steeper learning curve compared to some other tanks, just mainly because of the fact that Dark Deal has the cast time associated with it. But once you're able to basically learn to fight and know how to tank things such as Sorc tank, beyond that, it's just learning how to maximize your buff and debuff uptimes. Buff and debuff uptimes are really what separate out good tanks from great tanks and great tanks from awesome tanks. So really, really hammer down mechanics. So once you know the mechanics like you know the back of your own hand, that's when you can start focusing on learning debuffs and buffs. So that's the first thing that I do as a tank whenever something new comes out. What are the mechanics? What are the moves? What can I dodge roll? What can I dodge? What can I block? What can I not dodge roll? Things like that. So that part of it comes from just tanking things continuously. Things like non-DLC dungeons, DLC dungeons, trials. Do them on normal even because even though a lot of the newer content normal does not really feel like a challenge, it's still important to know the mechanics as a tank. So don't feel afraid to just run things on normal to kind of get a feel for what the mechanics look like, what the animations look like, and so on and so forth. But that's pretty much it for this build video. If you guys have any questions about tanking or this build, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. There aren't that many Sorc tanks remaining out there that I know of that play high-level PvE content that also stream. But if I ever find one, I will leave them down in the comment section below, in the description I should say below, so you guys can check out their stream. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.